Fort Braddock was the kind of place where tradition was baked into the very dust that coated every surface, a fine, gritty powder that clung to uniforms and settled in the lungs. It lingered in the air like the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder, unmistakable, stubborn, and not easily wiped away. The base had a long, storied history of producing hardened warriors, iron-fisted leaders, and the ghosts of soldiers who never truly left the field, even after the wars were over. It was the kind of place where orders weren't questioned and power flowed downward like a steel chain, linked by unforgiving link. But then, Captain Elena Torres arrived, and for the first time in a long time, something in that chain began to rattle. She wasn't the tallest officer on the base, nor the loudest. She didn't wear a chest full of flashy medals, though she had earned her share. What she did have was presence, the kind of quiet, unshakable gravity that made even the most seasoned sergeants instinctively straighten their posture when she entered a room. It wasn't a reaction born of fear, but of a deep, almost grudging respect. She didn't need to yell to be heard. Her clarity was her volume. She didn't need to posture. Her competence was her strength. She led through precision, discipline, and something else, something harder to define. Maybe it was her eyes. They were sharp and intelligent, but held a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of experience. At only 32, she was already a seasoned tactical commander. She had a combat tour in Iraq, followed by 2 more in the mountains of Afghanistan. Her file contained commendations for exemplary field leadership, a Purple Heart for a wound she never, ever spoke about, and a classified record of missions that had saved more lives than she could ever bring herself to count. She never bragged about her history, never reminded people what she had been through. That wasn't her style. Raised in a military family from the heart of San Antonio, Alina had learned from a young age that discipline was not just a virtue, it was a survival mechanism. Her father, a retired Marine drill instructor, had never tolerated excuses. "Do the job, or don't bother putting on the boots," he used to say, his voice a low rumble that left no room for argument. Her mother, a quiet schoolteacher, had taught her something equally vital: how to speak with steel in her voice without ever raising it an inch. She joined the army not because she was chasing a family legacy, but because she wanted to earn something that no one could ever give her. She trained harder than anyone else in her class, stayed later, and absorbed every piece of knowledge she could: tactics, theory, survival skills, the intricacies of the chain of command, strategy, and the complex ethics of combat. She had no patience for laziness, and even less for injustice. By the time she was assigned to Fort Braddock, she had already earned the quiet, solid admiration of those who valued competence over charisma. But that admiration was a shield that couldn't protect her from what was coming. Colonel Everett Briggs had been running Fort Braddock like his personal kingdom for 6 long years. A decorated veteran of the Gulf War, he was a man who believed in 3 things: tradition, punishment, and absolute control. On paper, his record was impeccable, and he was respected by the top brass at the Pentagon. In person, he was feared. He called his leadership style command presence. The soldiers under him had other, less charitable names for it, usually whispered in the dark of the barracks. He was in his late 50s, with sharp, calculating eyes and a permanent scowl carved into his jawline. His boots never had a speck of dust on them, even during a desert windstorm. Every soldier on the base knew of his wrath. Some had been quietly reassigned to career-ending posts because of it. Others had simply learned to bury their complaints deep enough to forget they even existed. When Alina met him for the first time during the mandatory officer orientation, he had barely bothered to glance at her file before dismissing her. "Another soft promotion from the new school," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer a reply. She just held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, her own eyes cool and unreadable. That was when the tension began, wordless, slow burning, but as real and undeniable as the flag flying over the parade ground. At first, it came in subtle, dismissive jabs. During the daily officer briefings, he would cut her off mid-sentence with snide remarks like, "That's a civilian solution, Captain, not a soldier's answer." When she submitted meticulously detailed training reports, he would mark them up in aggressive red pen with notes like, "Overthinking again. Stick to the basics." He would publicly question her unit's maneuvers during drills, only to reissue the exact same orders under his own name the next day. It wasn't constructive criticism, it was a campaign of erosion designed to wear her down, to remind her and everyone else of where she stood in his hierarchy. Alina endured it all with a quiet, unyielding grit. Not because she was weak, but because she knew how this particular game was played. She wasn't a naive lieutenant fresh out of training. She had seen what happened to good soldiers who spoke up too early or too loudly. The army had its rules, but it also had its shadows. And in those shadows, men like Colonel Briggs thrived. Despite his efforts, she kept her unit sharp. Under her command, they performed cleaner drills, ran better field simulations, and maintained tighter logistics than any other company on the base. Her soldiers respected her deeply, even if they didn't dare say it out loud anywhere near the command staff. Then came the whispers, low murmurs that traveled through the barracks like a contagion. Stories from other female officers who had been rotated out of Fort Braddock with little or no explanation. Reports of uncomfortable encounters in his office, of inappropriate comments made off the record, of an unwelcome proximity that was always deniable. None of it had ever stuck. Briggs had friends in all the right places. He had a reputation that reached far beyond the fences of Fort Braddock. But Alina paid attention. She filed every whisper away. One evening, after a grueling 10-hour field training session, she returned to her quarters to find a folded note slid under her door. It was anonymous. Asterisk, be careful. He's watching you closer than the others. Asterisk, there was no signature, just that. Her skin went cold. 2 weeks later, it happened. She had just finished reviewing a logistics map in the operations room, the last one to leave for the night. As she was packing her bag, Colonel Briggs entered the room alone. He shut the door behind him with a soft but definitive click. "Captain," he said, his voice low and dismissive. "You seem to have a bad habit of making the men under your command uncomfortable." She didn't respond, just continued to pack her things. "You think all that discipline makes you respected," he continued, taking a step closer. "It doesn't. It just makes you uptight." Her shoulders straightened, her movements pausing. "With all due respect, sir, I am here to lead soldiers, not to make them comfortable." His eyes narrowed into slits. "You're bold, Captain. Bold for a woman." Her blood ran cold, but her face remained a mask of professional calm. "I'll take that as a compliment, sir." He moved even closer then, invading her personal space, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her face. She didn't back down. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked him dead in the eye and said, her voice like ice, "Permission to be dismissed, sir." There was a long, charged pause. His smug smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of surprise. Something in her unwavering stare had pierced through the layers of rank, ego, and power. He took a slow step back. Without waiting for his verbal dismissal, she turned and walked out of the room. Outside, the night wind had picked up. It rattled the flagpole overhead, the same one they all saluted every single morning. But something was different now. Something was about to break. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it wasn't going to be her. Alina Torres walked back to her barracks that night with her fists clenched so tightly that her fingernails left crescent-shaped marks in her palms. It wasn't a clench of fear, but of pure, calculated restraint. She had been in firebases where enemy mortars fell like rain, but nothing had ever crawled under her skin with the same invasive chill as that encounter with Colonel Briggs. His words echoed in her ears, a toxic refrain, bold for a woman. It was as if her rank, her training, her entire career were conditional, a temporary privilege he could revoke with a sneer. As if his position gave him the right to corner her like prey, to imply that her discipline and decorum were not assets, but feminine weaknesses. She paced the small floor of her room for hours before finally forcing herself onto her bunk, her combat boots still on. By sunrise, the base had returned to its familiar, grinding routine. The sound of marching orders, the taste of sand in every crevice, the sharp clinking of steel on rifle barrels. But Alina noticed the change immediately. It was in the glances, the ones that lingered a fraction of a second too long, and the ones that deliberately avoided hers altogether. Soldiers who had once saluted her with pride now seemed to look over their shoulders before acknowledging her presence. The word had spread, or at least the sentiment had. Something was shifting, and it wasn't good. Briggs hadn't made a formal move against her yet, but the message had been sent. She had drawn a line in the sand, and he was a man who never forgot a challenge and certainly never forgave one. During that week's officer briefing, his animosity became more visible. Alina gave her usual situation report, her delivery as thorough and crisp as ever. She outlined 3 distinct inconsistencies she had identified in a supply drop manifest for the Southern Training Range. It was nothing controversial, just facts supported by data. But halfway through her debrief, Briggs interrupted her with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We'll stick to the standard process, Captain. I'm not interested in micromanagement from junior officers." The silence that fell over the room was deafening. She wasn't a junior officer. She was a company commander, a captain. She was technically next in line to lead the base if Briggs were ever removed or incapacitated. The comment wasn't born of ignorance. It was a deliberate, public message to everyone in the room. She remained calm, gave a single, sharp nod, and sat down. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting around the table. Some looked embarrassed for her. None said a word. Later that day, in the mess hall, she overheard one lieutenant whisper to another, "He's gunning for her." A friend of hers passed by and quietly said, "Watch your back, Torres." She didn't turn around. She didn't react. But inside, she filed the information away like a mission objective. Asterisk target is escalating. Maintain position. Do not retreat. Asterisk 2 days later, Briggs ordered a surprise physical stress test for the entire battalion. But the focus was clearly on Alina's unit. It was a brutal circuit. 3-mile runs, endless push-ups, and grueling sandbag drills, all in full combat gear under the unforgiving noon sun. She knew exactly what game he was playing. He wanted to break her squad, to see them exhausted and outperformed by the other units. He wanted a public failure that he could use as a weapon against her. But if Colonel Briggs had underestimated anything, it was that her team wasn't just trained, they were loyal. Her soldiers didn't just respect her, they admired her. They admired her because she trained with them, she bled with them, and she never once demanded their respect. She earned it every single day. That afternoon, as they lined up in formation for the stress test, Alina took her position right beside them, helmet on, rifle in hand. She wasn't leading from above, she was leading from within. A young private, a wiry 19-year-old from Detroit named Morales, whispered to her, "You don't have to run with us, ma'am." She gave him a sharp, determined look. "You're not running without me." They finished the circuit first. Every last one of them. Briggs watched from the observation tower overlooking the field, his lips pressed into a tight, thin line, a clipboard clutched in his hands so tightly it looked like he wanted to snap it in half. That night, another anonymous note appeared in her locker. Asterisk careful. He's losing face. That's when he gets dangerous. Asterisk there was no name, no handwriting she could identify, just a stark confirmation of what she already knew to be true. By the end of the week, Briggs had shifted his strategy again. Instead of overt displays of power, he started a campaign of quiet sabotage, eroding her authority through subtle, systemic means. Supply requisitions from her unit were mysteriously delayed. 2 of her scheduled training simulations were canceled at the last minute without notice. Her official recommendations for promotion for 2 of her best corporals were denied without any justification. And worst of all, Briggs began speaking directly to her squad members during drills, bypassing her completely, deliberately undermining her chain of command. To the outside world, these were just bureaucratic hiccups. Internally, they were precision strikes, aimed directly at her leadership. One evening, as she sat alone in the motor pool reviewing maintenance reports under the dim glow of a single bulb, Staff Sergeant Reeves approached. He was one of her most trusted NCOs, a quiet mountain of a man with 15 years under his belt and eyes that missed nothing. He stood silently for a moment, then said, his voice a low rumble, "We know what he's doing, Captain." Alina looked up from the paperwork. "We talk. We see what's happening. We're behind you." Her voice was quiet. Sometimes that's not enough. Reeves shook his head, a grim look on his face. He's not just poking the bear anymore. He's about to punch it. She nodded slowly. Then let's be ready when he does. It wasn't fear she felt anymore. It was a cold, sharp clarity. She had spent her entire career mastering strategy, tactics, and self-control. She had always believed that discipline was the highest form of strength, but she was beginning to understand that some situations didn't call for silent endurance. Some called for standing so firm, so unbreakably, that even giants had to step around you or fall trying. That moment came faster than she had expected. 3 days later, during a public drill exercise in front of 282 soldiers from across the battalion, Colonel Briggs staged his final confrontation. Alina had issued a perfectly standard command to reposition half of her unit during a live-fire maneuver. But Briggs, standing off to the side with a group of visiting officers, shouted across the field, deliberately calling her out. "Captain Torres, who gave you the authority to override my formation?" Her voice remained steady, amplified slightly by her radio. Per field protocol, "Sir, I observed a tactical vulnerability in the left flank and took the initiative to correct it." He cut her off, striding forward until he was in the center of the field, in front of the entire division. "That is not your call to make, Captain." Soldiers in formation turned their heads, eyebrows raised, eyes wide. Something electric, something dangerous, crackled in the air. Alina stood her ground. "Sir, I acted in accordance with standard operating procedure. Don't you dare lecture me on standards," he roared, and that's when he did it. He stepped directly into her personal space, closer than any protocol allowed. His face was inches from hers. His hand began to rise, not fast, not yet striking, but rising with clear, unmistakable intent. Every breath on that field held still. It was the moment she had known would come, and she was ready. The air hung heavy and still, as if the base itself was holding its breath, anticipating the eruption that was about to occur. A long, thin row of clouds passed overhead, darkening the sun just enough to cast long, dramatic shadows across the dusty drill yard. 282 soldiers stood frozen in their formations, their eyes locked on the two figures at the center of the storm. Colonel Everett Briggs, his face a mask of crimson fury, and Captain Alina Torres, her expression composed, but her body coiled like a spring, standing tall and unmoving in front of her unit. Briggs's hand was still in the air, not yet descended, but unmistakably raised in a gesture of aggression. That act alone was a flagrant violation of Army protocol. It was a threat, a public warning, and a raw declaration of his power. But more than that, it was a colossal mistake. Alina had trained her entire life to recognize danger, not just on the battlefield with incoming fire, but in moments precisely like this, when unchecked power warped into the prelude of violence. She didn't move yet. She held her ground, wanting every single soldier on that field to witness the unvarnished truth of the moment. She had not escalated this. He had. Briggs leaned even closer, his lips curling into a vicious sneer. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my men, Captain? They are not your men," she thought. Aloud, she replied, her voice perfectly even. "I followed field protocol, sir. You taught it yourself in last month's command briefing." That should have been the end of it. A logical, factual response that de-escalated the situation. But Briggs didn't want logic. He wanted absolute, fearful obedience. He wanted to see her break. And Alina Torres had no intention of giving him that satisfaction. "I'll teach you something else right now," he hissed, his voice venomous. And his hand moved downward. He didn't slap. He struck, a flat-palmed strike aimed directly for her face, with the kind of force that was meant to leave both physical and psychological marks. But his hand never made contact. The very second his shoulder twitched forward, her training, honed over years in classified, high-stakes environments, erupted like a firestorm. Years of Krav Maga, hand-to-hand defensive tactics, and close-quarters combat drills all compressed into a single, explosive, and perfectly controlled second. Her left hand shot up, intercepting his wrist in midair with a solid thud. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, pulled his arm forward, and stepped through with a practiced, fluid motion that reversed his own force directly against him. A loud, sharp crack echoed across the silent parade ground. The sound was as definitive and shocking as a gunshot. Every soldier in the formation flinched, some out of pure shock, others from the combat instinct to take cover. Colonel Briggs dropped to one knee, his mouth agape, the breath stolen from his lungs by the sudden, blinding pain. His right arm dangled at an unnatural, sickening angle. His face, once red with rage, had turned a pasty, ashen white. Alina released her grip immediately, her body still tight with adrenalized control. She wasn't breathing heavily. She didn't even blink. She simply stood over him, her voice as even and icy as a frozen lake. "You will never raise your hand to me again, Colonel." A wave of gasps rippled through the ranks of soldiers. No one moved. No one spoke. Some looked at each other in sheer disbelief. Others stared at Alina with something approaching reverence. A medic, stationed at the edge of the drill yard, sprinted forward, already speaking into his radio, calling for backup. Briggs didn't speak. Perhaps he couldn't. His lips quivered, his eyes wide with the combined shock of excruciating pain and utter public humiliation. Alina turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the formation, making direct eye contact with her soldiers. Her voice, when she spoke, was firm and clear enough to carry across the entire field. "Back to attention. Formation remains intact." They obeyed instantly, not because of her rank, but because something far greater, far more fundamental, had just unfolded before their eyes. On that dusty field, respect was no longer being commanded. It had been earned, burned into the very dirt beneath their boots. From the second-story observation tower, a major and a cluster of junior officers watched the scene unfold with wide eyes and slack jaws. No one had expected this, not even those who had long suspected that Briggs's volatile behavior would one day explode. But no one, absolutely no one, had expected Captain Torres to be the one to detonate the years of silence. Within minutes, the drill was officially suspended. The soldiers were dismissed back to their barracks, though few moved with any real speed. The energy on the base had fundamentally shifted. Rumors began to spread like wildfire, faster than any radio transmission could ever hope to keep up. "Did you see it? She really broke his arm. He tried to hit her first. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there like a damn statue. About time. It's about damn time someone stood up to him." Back in her Spartan officer's quarters, Alina sat alone at her desk, her helmet removed, her hands clasped tightly together, still vibrating from the fading adrenaline. Her muscles ached, not from the physical exertion of the takedown, but from the immense control it had taken not to do more. She hadn't wanted to hurt him, but she had absolutely refused to be humiliated, especially not in front of her soldiers. Not again. A sharp knock rattled her door. She opened it to find Staff Sergeant Reeves. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes gleamed with a light she hadn't seen before. "Captain," he said quietly, "word is already moving up the chain of command." She nodded. "I figured as much." He looked past her for a moment, into the quiet, orderly space of her office, then back at her. "Just so you know, Captain, you didn't lose anyone out there today. If anything, you earned more loyalty in those 10 seconds than some officers get in 20 years. She didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, she said, "This won't be the end of it." "No, ma'am," he replied, a grim certainty in his voice. "It's the beginning." Within the hour, military investigators from Regional Command arrived on the base. Medical personnel confirmed Colonel Briggs's injury, a full radial fracture of the forearm. The official paperwork began its slow, inexorable grind. Testimonies were collected, statements were taken, and video footage from the field's multiple surveillance cameras was retrieved. But even before the formal inquiry had officially begun, something far more significant, far more powerful, had already taken root. The soldiers of Fort Braddock had witnessed something they would never, ever forget. It wasn't a brawl. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a woman of unwavering principle, standing unshakable in the face of abuse, fully prepared to absorb whatever consequence might follow. And quietly, in every corner of the base, the whispers started to turn into voices. She stood her ground. She showed us how. She snapped more than just his arm. She snapped the silence. The colonel's scream, cut off abruptly by the sickening snap of bone, had rung through every corner of the drill yard. In its wake came a silence that was heavy, unblinking, and breathless. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence that comes from a profound, collective realization. It was the kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. Colonel Briggs was carried away on a stretcher 30 minutes later, his arms secured and immobilized, his ego far less stable. He refused to look at anyone, not his soldiers, not the medics, Not even the base general who had rushed to the scene after the commotion. The once imposing man who strode across the grounds like a warlord now lay vulnerable, his mouth a tight line of pain, his pride shattered into 1,000 pieces. And Alina Torres, she didn't hide. She didn't run. She stood in place while the field cleared around her, her shoulders squared, her boots firmly grounded, the same way she had stood her ground in active combat zones. This hadn't been about rage. It had never been about revenge. It had been about a line that, once crossed, demanded immediate and decisive action. As protocol dictated, she was ordered to report immediately to the administrative wing of the base. The investigating officer, a rigid, by-the-book colonel from the Pentagon named Felix Meyer, sat behind a sterile metal desk in an office where time seemed to freeze. He already had the footage playing on a continuous loop on his laptop. Drone cam footage, helmet cam footage from a soldier in the front row, a wide-angle shot from a base surveillance camera. Each one replayed the same 2-second takedown from a different, damning angle. When Alina stepped into the room, Meyer paused the video, the image of Briggs's arm at an unnatural angle frozen on the screen. His eyes met hers. "Have a seat, Captain." She did. He leaned forward, tapping a pen rhythmically on the table. "Colonel Briggs has a broken arm. You fractured his radius. His preliminary statement claims you attacked him without provocation in front of the entire battalion." Alina didn't blink. "He raised his hand to strike me, sir." Meyer nodded slowly. "So I see. The footage confirms that much. But still, you acted physically against a superior officer. That is a very serious matter." Her voice remained perfectly even. "He attempted to strike me. That is also a very serious matter." He let that statement hang in the air for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Why didn't you attempt to de-escalate the situation?" "I did, sir," she said calmly. "By stopping the assault before it landed, using the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat." He stared at her. She stared back. The truth between them was a solid wall that neither of them could step around. He tapped the video file on his laptop again, letting out a soft sigh. "There are going to be formal hearings, Captain. You know that. But do you know what's odd? Since this incident occurred less than 2 hours ago, my inbox has been flooded with unsolicited statements from your fellow officers. Some are short, some are incredibly detailed, but they all mention the same thing: Colonel Briggs's long history of behavior." She said nothing. "I was prepared to believe this might have been an isolated incident," he continued. "That's what his official file suggested. But it turns out it's not." Again, she remained silent, letting him connect the dots himself. "Do you know what else they're saying?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. She waited. "They're saying you didn't act out of impulse. You acted with perfect control. They're saying you're a good officer, a better leader than most on this base. And that if it had been anyone else standing in front of Colonel Briggs that day, there would have been blood." She looked him dead in the eyes. There almost was. Colonel Meyer didn't press her any further. He handed her a temporary suspension order and escorted her out of the office. There were no handcuffs, no shouting, no public shaming. Outside, soldiers stood in scattered groups, their work for the day seemingly forgotten. Some paused their conversations as she passed. Others watched her silently, their expressions not of judgment, but of something different: recognition, respect. Sergeant Reeves was waiting at the edge of the walkway, his arms folded across his massive chest. As she approached, he fell into step beside her. "They taking you off the line?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "Until they decide if stopping an assault on an officer by an officer is still a punishable offense." He exhaled sharply through his nose. "This place has needed a reckoning for a long, long time." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. At the far edge of the training field, a group of young privates stood whispering. One of them, Morales, watched her with wide, unblinking eyes, not afraid, not scandalized, but inspired. She looked away. This hadn't been about building a legacy. She hadn't acted for applause. But it was too late now. She had lit a fire, and people were already starting to warm their hands by it. That night, her barracks door stayed closed. She didn't go to dinner. She didn't scroll through the base intranet or reread the Army Code of Conduct. She sat on the edge of her bunk, her boots still on, and stared at her hands. They weren't shaking. She wasn't sorry. She was just quiet. In the morning, she would wake up in a new version of Fort Braddock, one where every single soldier remembered what they had seen: a colonel crossing a line, and a captain refusing to bow. Taped to the outside of her door, left there without a signature, was a hand-drawn sketch, just simple pencil on paper. It showed a lone soldier standing tall while a large shadow loomed behind her, its hand raised in threat. The soldier in the drawing didn't flinch. She didn't even look back. And across the top of the page, scrolled in rough, block letters, were 4 words. Asterisk strength isn't loud. It just doesn't move. Asterisk by the next morning, Fort Braddock had become a battlefield of whispers. The raw, physical confrontation between Colonel Briggs and Captain Alina Torres had ignited more than just a scandal. It had exposed a long, simmering wound in the base's command structure. The phrase, "she snapped his arm," was on every tongue, repeated with a mixture of shock and awe. But underneath that surface-level gossip, a different, deeper conversation had begun, one that was long overdue. Asterisk, she stood up. She didn't flinch. She did what we all wish we could have done. Asterisk, the United States Army did not like drama. The institution thrived on order, discipline, and the predictable rhythm of routine. So when something disrupted that rhythm, especially something so physical, so public, and so irrefutably caught on camera, it scrambled to respond with overwhelming force. Investigators had already arrived on the base the previous night, but now, higher-ranking officials from the regional command were being flown in. Emergency meetings were called, confidential briefings were held, and the words containing the fallout were heard more than once in the hallowed halls of the command building. But this wasn't a scandal that could be easily contained. The story wasn't just about a broken arm anymore. It was about what that arm represented: unchecked authority, power without accountability, and a system that had, for years, turned a blind eye when abuse wore a uniform. And now, someone had finally cracked that system wide open, like a dry bone. Alina Torres sat quietly in a makeshift administrative room that had been set up for her in the medical wing. It was where she was temporarily assigned while the formal investigation unfolded. She wasn't in handcuffs. She wasn't under arrest. She was, officially, on administrative reassignment pending inquiry. But unofficially, she had become the center of gravity for the entire base. Officers walked past the open door of her room with conflicted expressions. Some were cold and distant. Some offered a brief, respectful nod, and a few looked at her with an expression of quiet, profound gratitude. A few avoided her altogether, not out of contempt, but out of fear of being seen taking a side. The base was dividing, not violently, but clearly. Those who had suffered silently under Colonel Briggs's reign of fear felt something that tasted like justice. Those who had benefited from his brand of leadership felt the ground trembling beneath their boots. She wasn't surprised. The truth had a way of forcing people to choose a side. Staff Sergeant Reeves visited her during the midday lull. He brought her a lukewarm coffee in a paper cup and a look that said everything words couldn't. "They're scared," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Of me?" Alina asked, raising an eyebrow. "Of what you started," he clarified. She looked out the window at the motor pool below. Soldiers moved with their usual routine precision, but their eyes were more alert, their posture just a little more upright. There was a new energy in the air, tense but expectant. Reeves leaned against the door frame. "I've been stationed here for 10 years, Captain. Do you have any idea how many informal complaints Briggs had against him?" She turned back to face him. "Officially 0. But off the record, I've got a list in my head that's a mile long. And so do a lot of us. Mostly women. Some junior officers. Even a chaplain, once. They all either got transferred out or were silenced." Alina wasn't shocked. She had seen the same pattern play out in other commands throughout her career. But here, at Fort Braddock, it had metastasized, left untouched and unchecked for far too long. "I didn't hit him to prove a point," she said quietly. "I know," Reeves replied. "But you did anyway." That afternoon, the whispers turned into a flood of formal statements. Dozens of them. Anonymous submissions through a newly established tip line, signed testimonies delivered directly to the investigators. Years of suppressed complaints now flowed like a breached dam. Soldiers, both enlisted and commissioned, stepped forward to describe a pattern of verbal abuse, career-sabotaging threats, public harassment, and a command climate built on fear. What Alina's act of defiance had triggered wasn't just an incident, it was a reckoning. Briggs, still recovering in the base hospital, refused to comment. His lawyer, a defense legal advisor who had been flown in from Washington, D.C., issued a brief statement claiming that his client had been provoked by an insubordinate officer and had acted in the interest of maintaining good order and discipline. But the footage said otherwise. 3 different camera angles all showed the same thing. One raised hand, one precise takedown, one loud, unmistakable snap. It didn't help his case that just a week before the incident, he had given a speech to new recruits praising old-school discipline and mocking the military's supposedly oversensitive new culture. The irony was too sharp to be ignored. By the end of the day, Alina was summoned into a confidential conference room to meet with 3 senior officers and a legal advisor. The presiding officer, General Marlene Huxley, was a stone-faced woman who had clawed her way up through decades of combat service and bureaucratic trenches. She studied Alina for a long, silent moment before speaking. "Captain Torres," she began, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have caused quite a disruption." Alina didn't respond. She didn't know yet if that was meant as a praise or an accusation. General Huxley continued, "The video footage is clear. The testimonies we have received are damning for Colonel Briggs. However, your own conduct still breaks protocol. Striking a superior officer, regardless of the context, puts this command in a very difficult position." "I did not strike him, ma'am," Alina said, her voice calm and steady. "I defended myself." "Which you are entitled to do," the legal advisor chimed in. "But the definition of self-defense in the Army isn't always the same as it is on the street. Your restraint is noted, as is the proportionality of your response." There was a long pause. "We are not here to punish you, Captain," General Huxley finally said. "But we also cannot ignore the institutional implications of your actions." Alina straightened her posture. "I understand, ma'am. But with respect, ignoring the problem is what allowed him to operate like this for so long." That stopped General Huxley. For a brief, fleeting moment, something flickered behind her eyes. A memory, perhaps, or a flicker of understanding. She gave a single, sharp nod. "There will be an official inquiry," she said. "But between us, what you did has already changed this base. You should be prepared for more attention, and possibly more responsibility." Alina didn't flinch. "I didn't ask for it, ma'am." "No," General Huxley agreed. "But sometimes leadership is about what you stand for when no one else will." As Alina left the room, a young junior officer passed her in the hallway and rendered a salute. It wasn't stiff or formal. It was a salute accompanied by a slight nod of profound respect, the salute of one soldier to another, one who had just lit the path forward for everyone else. 3 days after the incident, Fort Braddock didn't feel like Fort Braddock anymore. The very air seemed sharper, cleaner. Orders were delivered more carefully, with a newfound sense of professional respect. Even the rhythmic cadence of the morning drills sounded different, less like a robotic performance and more like soldiers consciously reclaiming their dignity. For the first time in years, troops spoke openly during chow, not in the hushed, fearful tones that had become the norm. The entire base buzzed with a subtle but powerful new energy. But while the surface of the base simmered with this new atmosphere, underneath it all, a war was still being fought. A war without bullets, fought with paperwork, politics, and perception. Captain Alina Torres remained on administrative reassignment. Her uniform was still crisp, her posture as straight as ever, but her duty roster was completely empty. There were no briefings to attend, no squads to lead, no field time to oversee. She spent most of her days in a small, borrowed office, reviewing old logistics records or assisting with other non-critical administrative tasks. She was a placeholder, a pause, but she was not a silence. Because while her boots weren't in the mud, her name was everywhere, in every inbox, in every hallway whisper, in every legal memo being drafted. She had become the face of something much bigger than she had ever intended. And that fact terrified the Army's upper ranks even more than the broken arm of one of their colonels. The next morning, a new face arrived on the base. Brigadier General Curtis Layden, sent directly from the Department of the Army headquarters at the Pentagon. He was a man with impeccably polished boots, unreadable eyes, and a long, successful history of silencing scandals before they ever hit the headlines. He immediately called a closed-door meeting with General Huxley and the legal team. His message was brutally clear: calm the waters, reassert control. Keep Fort Braddock off the front page of the news. But there was a problem. The story was already moving. Independent military blogs had picked it up. Private veteran forums were filled with rampant speculation. A new phrase, the snap herd round the base, was trending on private social media networks for service members. Anonymous sources, likely junior officers from the base, had already leaked that the Army's internal review had uncovered a long and damning history of misconduct by Colonel Briggs. The number of formal complaints had now passed 30, with some going back as far as 8 years. Some had been shelved without action, while others had been resolved quietly with the reassignment of the complainant. Briggs, meanwhile, had been discreetly transferred out of the base hospital under armed escort. He hadn't spoken to the press, but his lawyer had, issuing a press release that called the incident a career assassination and claiming that the Army had allowed toxic feminism to infiltrate its command structure. The backlash to his statement was instant and fierce, coming from both sides of the issue. Some older, more traditional officers echoed his words behind closed doors. Others ripped the rank patches off their own uniforms in protest and posted the photos online with the caption, "Protect those who protect others." That evening, Captain Torres was called once again to General Huxley's office. This time, General Layden was waiting for her. He didn't offer her a seat. "Captain," he said coldly, "you've made quite a name for yourself." She didn't flinch. "I didn't ask to, sir." "No," he agreed. "But the consequences of your actions, whether they were justified or not, are spiraling out of control fast." He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "There are journalists calling every hour. A United States senator is asking questions. Veterans groups are organizing protests. You have become the focal point of a movement, Captain, and movements are not good for military discipline." Alina met his gaze, her own eyes like chips of ice. "Neither is protecting abusers, sir." The statement hung in the air like a live charge, waiting to ignite. Layden's jaw tightened. "You are walking a very thin line." Alina stood even straighter. So was he. I just didn't let him cross it. General Huxley finally interjected, her voice firm. "Sir, with all due respect, this situation has already moved beyond our internal control. We can either lead the conversation or we will be drowned by it." Layden exhaled sharply, clearly displeased. "Fine. Then we control the message. Captain Torres will be transferred, temporarily, to Westfield Command Center. Publicly, it will be labeled as a routine leadership rotation. Privately, it gets her out of the line of fire while this whole thing cools down." Alina raised an eyebrow. "You're removing me from my unit, from my base." Layden almost smirked. "We're promoting you, Captain." That stunned her into silence. He turned to General Huxley. "Submit the paperwork. Effective immediately. Make it clean. And there will be no press statements until we have drafted one." Then he left, his polished boots echoing down the empty corridor. Outside the building, Staff Sergeant Reeves was waiting for her. "You're being moved," he asked as she stepped out into the evening air. She nodded. "Westfield Command Center. A rotation. Effective now." He hesitated for a moment. "Is that a win?" Alina didn't answer immediately. "They're dressing it up like one," she said eventually. "But it's containment." "But they didn't bury you, Captain," Reeves replied, a hint of admiration in his voice. "That counts for something." She looked out over the base. The soldiers continued their evening routines, but there was a definite shift in the atmosphere. More heads were held high. More backs were straightened. More voices were raised without fear. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was just the beginning. That night, she packed her gear in silence. The barracks were still. Her duffel was almost full when a quiet knock tapped on her door. Private Morales stood there, looking nervous but determined. "Ma'am," he said, rendering a salute. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not for what you did to him, but for what you showed us." Alina nodded slowly. "Hold the line, Private." Morales's eyes welled up slightly. "We will, ma'am." As the door closed, Alina sat on the edge of her bed one last time. Her boots were laced. Her heart was steady. In the end, she hadn't sought glory. She had just refused to look away. And in doing so, she had given hundreds of others the permission to do the same. Westfield Command Center sat on a low, rolling rise in Virginia's foggy countryside, a sleek, modern concrete complex built to monitor military operations across the entire Eastern Division. From the air, it looked sterile and unnervingly quiet. Inside, It was anything but. Captain Alina Torres arrived under the official cover of a temporary transfer order. Her new title was Strategic Operations Liaison. It sounded impressive, but it was vague and contained, just the way the higher-ups at the Pentagon wanted it. But something unexpected happened within her first 48 hours at Westfield. They listened to her, not just to her rank, but to her voice. The officers she was assigned to work with weren't all aware of the specific details of what had happened at Fort Braddock, but many of them had heard the whispers. A few approached her in the hallway with quiet, respectful nods. One senior commander even stopped her in passing to thank her. "My daughter is stationed at Fort Riley," he said, his voice low. "I'm glad to know that people like you are still in uniform." Her reassignment hadn't buried her story, it had amplified it. And soon, she began to realize that it wasn't just at Westfield where things were changing. Across bases from Fort Hood to Fort Drum to Camp Pendleton, messages were being forwarded, online forums were buzzing, and letters were being written. Female soldiers and their male allies were sharing their own testimonies, stories that echoed the same painful pattern of intimidation, abuse, and institutional silence. But now, there was a name attached to the resistance: Torres. She had become more than just a captain. She had become a symbol. 1 week into her new assignment, she was called into a meeting by Major Layla Daniels, a sharp, no-nonsense operations analyst known for her bluntness and her battlefield promotions. "I've been authorized to put together a task force," Daniels said, sliding a thick file across the table toward Alina. "It's unofficial for now. An internal review of command climate, starting with bases that have reported unusual levels of complaint suppression." Alina opened the file. The first name on the list was Fort Braddock, followed by 5 others. "You're not just here to sit behind a screen and wait this out," Daniels continued, her eyes intense. "You're here because someone up there finally got the message, loud and clear." Alina studied the list of bases. She recognized 2 of the names, places she had served at early in her career. One of them was where she had first learned the hard lesson of keeping her mouth shut. Not this time, she thought. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. Daniels offered a rare half-smile. "I figured you would." Meanwhile, Colonel Briggs's story was unraveling like a cheap thread. A second, even larger wave of complaints had emerged, this time from former service members. Women who had resigned their commissions, men who had been demoted for speaking out, and even a former sergeant major who now admitted he had been forced into early retirement after defending a younger soldier against Briggs's public wrath. The military's legal division was forced to launch a formal, wide-ranging investigation. And when several major media outlets obtained heavily redacted files detailing the suppressed complaints, the public tide turned irrevocably against him. News anchors began to debate the toxic aspects of military command culture. High-profile veterans spoke out against the old guard. A retired 4-star general went on a national news program and said, "We tell our soldiers to protect the weak, but we so often fail to protect our own." Suddenly, the Army was under intense scrutiny from Capitol Hill. A bipartisan group of senators demanded a full accountability review. And in a move that hadn't happened in over 2 decades, an active duty colonel, Colonel Briggs, was referred to a public Article 32 hearing. Military justice would be served, not behind closed doors, but in the full view of the nation. Back at Westfield, Alina was working 16-hour days. She was no longer isolated. She was essential. Her new task force began reviewing complaint trends, command responses, and disciplinary records from across the entire region. The patterns that emerged were shockingly clear. Her team began drafting new policy recommendations: early intervention protocols, mandatory third-party reporting structures, and anonymous escalation routes that would bypass the local chain of command entirely. For the first time, real, systemic change was on paper, on the record. Still, the weight of her decision at Fort Braddock never left her. Sometimes she would lay awake at night, her boots placed neatly at the foot of her bed, wondering what would have happened if she hadn't reacted. What if she had stayed silent, as she had been trained to do so many times before? What if she had taken the slap, the humiliation, the threat, just one more time? But then she would remember the determined voice of Private Morales. "We will, ma'am." And she would remember her own mother's words the night before she had left for basic training. "Don't let anyone take your name from you, not even when it's hidden behind a uniform." 10 days later, She received a letter on official Army stationery, the envelope sealed in red. You are hereby requested to testify before the Article 32 hearing in Washington, D.C., regarding events occurring on Fort Braddock under the command of Colonel Everett Briggs. Her hands didn't shake, not even once. She folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the chest pocket of her uniform. When she looked up, Major Daniels was already waiting in the doorway of her office. Are you ready for what comes next? Alina gave a quiet, determined nod. I was ready the moment I stood up to him. Daniels smirked. Let's make it official then. News of her impending testimony broke before she even boarded the transport to Washington. Social media exploded again. One headline read, "Soldier who broke the silence now set to testify. Captain Torres to face down the system she defied." And suddenly, the question wasn't whether justice would be served for Colonel Briggs. It was whether the entire military could face its own reflection in the mirror and finally make peace with what it saw. The military courtroom at Fort Myer was unlike anything Captain Alina Torres had ever seen in her career. There was no camouflage here, only formal dress uniforms, dark oak-paneled walls, and the piercing, analytical eyes of generals, attorneys, reporters, and witnesses, all converging under the single, solemn banner of military justice. It was a rare public Article 32 hearing, open to the public due to the overwhelming national interest in the case. A silver-haired judge advocate general presided from an elevated bench. Armed guards stood at every exit. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but a team of sketch artists captured every intense glance, every bated breath. Colonel Briggs sat at the defense table, his right wrist still visibly bandaged, his eyes cold and defiant. He wore his dress blues like a suit of armor, his chest stacked high with ribbons from past conflicts. But the air in the courtroom didn't bend around him the way it once had on the base. That power was gone. He was not in command here. Alina entered the courtroom with her back straight, her eyes fixed forward. A hush fell over the crowded gallery. Even the reporters stopped typing. The soldiers in the audience, active duty and retired, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, sat a little taller as she passed. She was no longer just a captain. She had become a symbol, and symbols did not flinch. The prosecutor called her to the stand. Her oath was clear, strong, and unwavering. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. She told the panel about that day on the drill field. But she didn't stop there. She told them about the years that had led up to it, the toxic command climate, the quiet threats, the talented female officers who had mysteriously left, the men who had learned to turn their heads, the profound silence that had become a survival strategy at Fort Braddock. Colonel Briggs didn't just abuse his power, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. He modeled it. He taught it. He enforced it. And anyone who dared to challenge it became his next target. She paused, then added, her voice dropping slightly. I snapped his arm because I feared what might come next, not just for me, but for the 282 soldiers who were watching. I did what I was trained to do. I neutralized a threat. It just turns out the threat wasn't foreign. A ripple of gasps went through the crowd. Even the presiding judge leaned forward slightly. The defense attorney shot to his feet to object, but the judge overruled him. Let her speak. Alina continued, every word landing like a rifle crack. She told them about the informal report she had filed years ago at another base that had simply vanished. She told them about the complaint she had been warned would ruin her career. She told them about a junior female soldier in her platoon who had disappeared from her post after a single private meeting with Colonel Briggs. Each detail sharpened the narrative. This wasn't a one-time outburst. It was a systemic failure that had been allowed to fester until someone finally pushed back. Colonel Briggs eventually spoke in his own defense. He called her unstable, a disruption to the chain of command. He claimed she had exaggerated the moment and that no officer of proper bearing would ever lay a hand on a superior. But his words felt outdated, desperate. The courtroom didn't lean in when he spoke. They leaned away. Because this time, the story wasn't his to control. Over the next week, 4 more officers testified against him. One lieutenant described being publicly berated in front of an entire formation for refusing to join Briggs during an off-base celebration. Another recounted a drunken outburst where Briggs had threatened to ruin a female NCO's life with a single phone call. By the 5th day of the hearing, the outcome was clear. The panel deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Colonel Everett Briggs was found guilty of conduct unbecoming of an officer and gross abuse of authority under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was stripped of his command, demoted to the rank of captain, dishonorably discharged from the United States Army, and his case was referred to the federal civilian court system for additional assault and harassment charges. Alina didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and allowed herself to breathe, fully and deeply, for the first time in months. A week later, she returned to Fort Braddock, not as a soldier under suspicion, but as an invited guest of honor. General Huxley met her at the main gates. "You were right," she said simply. Alina raised an eyebrow. "About what, ma'am?" The general paused. "About what happens when one soldier stands up. It turns out, others follow." She walked Alina to the main parade field, where nearly 300 troops waited in perfect formation. Not for punishment, not for inspection, but for recognition. General Huxley handed her a formal citation. It bore the Army's official emblem and was signed by the Secretary of the Army himself. It was for extraordinary moral courage, physical discipline, and unwavering service to the principles of justice, equality, and honor. She then pinned a silver oak leaf cluster to Alina's chest. She had been promoted to the rank of major. Cheers erupted from the formation. Some soldiers clapped, others shouted her name. Private Morales, standing in the third row, wiped a tear from his cheek. Staff Sergeant Reeves rendered a sharp, proud salute, a wide grin on his face. She saluted back, and this time, she felt it. Not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as a leader. That night, in her new, larger quarters, she opened her notebook, the same one she had used to track every complaint, every silence, every crack in the system. She turned to a fresh, clean page, and at the top, she wrote just 2 words, *never again. Asterisk because the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And she was ready.